Redis Industries, makers of Utter Cream and Utterly Smooth Extra Care Cream enriched with urea to moisturize dry, cracked skin. 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com.
And by We Patients, where you can learn from others about possible triggers and potential treatments for your headaches or migraines. Online at wepatients.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 886. That number again to call, 800-732-2334. Or you can find it on our website, evolspharmacy.com.
How do you deal with uncertainty and vulnerability in your life? Some people overeat, others overspend, or drink to excess. We're talking today about why we should embrace vulnerability instead of seeing it as a weakness.
Dr. Brene Brown is a research professor at the University of Houston Graduate College of Social Work. We're talking today with her about her book, Daring Greatly, How the Courage to be Vulnerable Transforms the Way We Live, Love, Parent, and Lead.
Renee, you have focused on vulnerability in your TED Talk, in your book, and I think a lot of us would agree that, it sounds like a good idea, but there's this other part of us that says, well, we don't really want to be vulnerable. So help us understand, what does vulnerability mean, and why is it so important?
I think there's so much truth in that question, especially in the part where, it sounds great, and we can almost sometimes even intellectually acknowledge that there's something powerful and important about being vulnerable. But I think one of the greatest paradoxes that I've uncovered about vulnerability is it's the first thing I look for in you and the last thing I want to show you in me. In other people, when we see people being vulnerable, we see courage. In us, it feels like weakness. And I think, just to kind of set a foundation of what vulnerability is, when we went in and asked people, give us an example of vulnerability. What is vulnerability to you? I'll share some of the answers from the research. Vulnerability is my first date after my divorce. Vulnerability is trying to get pregnant after 2 miscarriages. Vulnerability is starting my own business. Vulnerability is saying I love you first. Vulnerability is making a piece of art and putting it on Etsy for sale. It's being really excited for my son who really wants to make first chair in orchestra and supporting him and getting excited for him and sending him off to school for tryouts and knowing that's probably not going to happen. So when we looked, we took all of these examples and we came up with a very simple definition of vulnerability. I define vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And, as you think about these examples or even think back in your own life, there's just no equation where being vulnerable equals being weak. One of the examples that came up often was vulnerability is reaching out to a friend who's gone through experienced a really traumatic loss. People gave examples of calling a friend whose wife had, died of a heart attack or who had lost a child. And we all know that feeling of kind of circling the phone and thinking, I don't want to call, what am I going to say? It's going to be so hard. But we also know the feeling of when we pick up the phone and we don't have anything to say that'll make it better because there's nothing that makes it better. All we can say is, I'm here, I care about you, I want you to know I'm with you in this. And when we hang up, we know we've done something brave. And so what I have found in my work is that the mythology that vulnerability is weakness doesn't pan out at all. And in fact, I think vulnerability is our most accurate measure of courage. When we look back at 11,000 pieces of data, when we go back to the data, I cannot find a single example of courage, moral courage, spiritual courage, leadership courage, that I see an example of courage his language was, it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, who strives valiantly, who, knows triumph, who knows defeat, but if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. And I think this idea of going into the arena and showing up in our families, in our partnerships, in our careers, putting a far-fetched idea on the table, raising our hand in class when we just went back to school in our 50s. I think initiating a really honest conversation with our partner about sex. I think those moments of daring greatly define our lives. I think that it's very difficult in our culture today. When we talked earlier in the first segment about scarcity, I think one of the things that accompanies scarcity in a culture is cynicism and criticism. And we live in a culture of what I call projectile criticism and reflexive cynicism. And so to walk into the arena and put ourselves out there to be all in feels incredibly dangerous and risky. I just don't know that it's ever as dangerous or risky as standing on the outside of our lives looking in and wondering. And when you ask the question, has it ever changed the course of people's lives? I think the answer is yes, and I get that a lot when I do interviewing in organizations. I spent a long weekend with 50 CEOs from Silicon Valley, many of whom are very well-known disruptive innovators in their own field. And when I asked them, what gets in the way primarily of innovation in organizations and, in art and, in any area, what they said was basically the fear of being laughed at, the fear of being ridiculed or judged or, feeling blamed or shamed. And they said the reason why there's such a scarcity of innovation right now in our culture is that there's never been an innovative idea put on a table where half the room didn't roll their eyes and laugh and walk out. They said you can put something that's evolutionary on the table and people will, often acknowledge that it could be a good idea. But if you want to do something truly revolutionary, truly transformative, most people will be critical of that. And so I think, from our work lives to our personal lives, when I talk to adults who are dating, online dating, real life dating, they talk excruciatingly about vulnerability and the fear of putting themselves out there, the fear of being hurt or rejected. So I think it's meaning making, and I think it's life defining.
Brene, you just mentioned CEOs, and when I think about CEOs, especially of the kinds of companies that you've been dealing with, these are people who give off tremendous sense of self-confidence and accomplishment. And in fact, we live in a culture where people are sort of, I think, rewarded for giving off those vibes. And the idea of bosses or parents giving the impression of vulnerability, it seems like an anathema, because that translates into, in many people's minds, weakness. And so how does somebody working in an environment where their boss is going to look at them a little funny if they're vulnerable, how do they overcome the fear that they're going to come across as kind of a weak person, as a person who's incapable of accomplishing everything, or in the case of a parent, showing weakness to a child?
It's interesting because one of the things I would say is, there's four big myths of vulnerability. The first one is that vulnerability is weakness. The second one is that we can opt out, that we can choose not to be vulnerable, that we can say, I don't do vulnerability. But the bottom line is to be alive is to be vulnerable. To be, in relationship is to be vulnerable. To be at work is, constant vulnerability because there's constant uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. The third myth is that vulnerability is letting it all hang out. That, standing in front of your executive team and saying, I'm scared, I don't know what I'm doing, and, I think my husband and I are getting a divorce, and my oldest child may be using drugs, and I'm not speaking to my sisters. That's not vulnerability. That's probably lack of boundaries. is that if you want to talk to folks who, when we interview people and say, tell us about the leader of your team, the leader of this organization, when people describe a leader that they would follow into a burning building kind of leader, the kind of people that are passionate about working on a team with, what we hear all the time is he or she is so real. These are leaders who stand up in front of people and may not share every ounce of their life personally because that's not appropriate, because there's a mindfulness about the role you play. But these are leaders who stand up and say, I don't have all the answers. I can't move this company forward on my own. I need help. I need your ideas. I need you to show up. I need you to be engaged. I need you to give me feedback about what I'm doing well and what I need to do differently to support you. Those are transformative leaders. And that kind of acknowledged vulnerability and transparency is very contagious in organizations. So when it starts, what we see is other leaders then stand up. To me, when I go into an organization, it's very interesting when I assess how vulnerability is viewed in an organization. In any system, this is a family too. Are people, do people have permission to say, I don't know, I need help, I don't understand, I'm concerned? Are people willing to say, I take responsibility for that, I made that choice? Are people willing to say, thank you, I'm sorry, I'd like to give it a shot, but I'm not quite sure I know how to do it yet? And so I think leaders have to make choices about whether their self-worth comes from kind of an all-knowing superhero persona, or if they're really interested in transformative leadership. And if they're interested in transformative leadership, we have to create cultures where, it's the whole idea of, failure's not an option. And when failure's not an option, neither is learning, creativity, or innovation. We have to make a choice. And what you see from a lot of transformational leaders around vulnerability and failure is a strong, passionate belief in productive failure. Fail fast, fail often, clean it up, learn from it, move on. And the willingness to share their own struggles. And so I think, honestly, the tide is turning around this. I think that impenetrable, I've got everything going on, I'm perfect. Not only does that breed distrust, because we know, we all know that doesn't exist in the human experience, it also breeds disengagement. I don't know you. I don't understand you. I can't connect with you. Therefore, I'm not inspired by you.
Renee,